and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Opposition rebels led by the Islamist militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, said on Sunday morning that they had captured the Syrian capital of Damascus and had driven Bashar al-Assad out of the country, bringing an end to more than 53 years of the Assad family's authoritarian rule over Syria. Many Syrians celebrated this historic event, but alarm bells are ringing in Europe, the US and Israel. To explore the implications of this situation, we're joined by Patrick Hilsman. He's a columnist with Turning Point magazine. Mr. Hilsman, welcome to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so lots to talk about here. Let's start with an overview. What do you make of the overthrow and the people that have committed it or done it?
Well, I think what we're looking at is more the collapse of the Assad regime than necessarily one particular group taking power. Certainly, it's true that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham now does control the levers of power and has formed what's essentially a transitional government with some former regime officials and members of their own coalition. So there are promising signs in the sense that they are allowing people who are not Muslim to walk around unveiled. There doesn't seem to be any overt retaliation against the communities of Aleppo or Damascus. But that being said, there have been some cases of atrocities being committed. There have been incidents that have been recorded, certainly with the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, which is an opposition group, which has been rampaging through Kurdish areas, killing civilians and attacking people. So while there's great jubilation, and I share it, and I think it's wonderful that the Assad regime is gone, this is definitely a new chapter, and it's wonderful to see all these people being released from the death camp at Sednaya. But Syria is still not safe, and there are a lot of places where fighting is still going on. So the group that took over, or the group that is the predominant power right now, is unquestionably a derivative of al-Qaeda. Unquestionably, Abu Muhammad Jolani was a member of al-Qaeda at some point, then the successor group Nusra, then JFS, and then HTS. So they've gone through many different changes, but they still do descend from that basic jihadist philosophy. And again, that being said, there are some very promising signs that they have clearly made some moves to try and reassure people that are not Muslim that they can survive under their rule.
Right, so a patchwork of groups, some with questionable histories, and there is supposed to be an election coming up to replace the interim government. Do you expect those elections to be fair, free and peaceful?
There are so many factors that depend on that. There's active fighting throughout different parts of the country. The different rebel groups are not necessarily all under the same umbrella. There were Druzi rebel groups from the south that pushed up towards Damascus. There was the American-backed Free Syrian Army group that was at al-Tanf in the south that launched an assault north. So there isn't necessarily a unified government yet. But I do think that the momentum of people, you can see people coming out in the streets from all communities very happy with an impression that they feel that their war is ending. So hopefully people will see elections and democracy as a way to peace, and then hopefully those elections will take place. I can't predict that.
We hope so, absolutely. Now let's zoom out a little bit and go to some of the responses from other countries. Let's start with Ayatollah al-Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, who's blaming, I suppose not surprisingly, Western governments for the overthrow of Assad's regime, US and Israel being amongst those, but also he noted another country, but didn't name it, and we are thinking it might be Turkey that he was referring to. Now, what do you take of that argument?
Actually, if I'm going to make something of the fact that he didn't mention Turkey, it could perhaps be the fact that Iran and Turkey frequently negotiate. So maybe they don't want to insult each other before they sit down at the negotiating table. It could also just be an oversight. So you don't know. But I think that most governments are probably welcoming the change. Most of what we're hearing from Western governments is cautious optimism. with obviously caveats related to the extremism of the main group. But the Iranian position is obvious. I mean, they wasted so much money in this conflict for this dictator. They sent thousands of their troops abroad, and they became involved in a larger conflict that ended up costing them dearly. And they did all of this for one man. And now their position is greatly weakened. So it's obvious that they're upset. It's obvious that they want to blame somebody. But the regime has no one to blame for themselves. They had all the foreign assistance in the world. They had help from the second largest air force in the world, second largest military in the world, Russia. They had the help of a nuclear power, Russia, and they were still unable to beat jihadists with light vehicles ultimately.
Right, okay. Let's move on now to Israel, who have already started airstrikes on Syria, who have destroyed the Syrian navy. They say basically Syria is now a threat to their country. How would you assess that dynamic?
I think it's deep cynicism. You see the Syrian people celebrating the end of what can only be described as some form of concentration camp at Sednaya. And then the Israeli government's immediate response is to celebrate the fall of a dynastic dictatorship by bombing the new country, by bombing the country that has just emerged from this terror. And I think that it's deeply cynical. I understand the position that they're trying to take, that they want to maintain what they call a qualitative edge over all neighbors, which means that they believe that they have the right to be the most powerful nation in the region by multiple factors. And in order to achieve that, the Israeli government has a policy of not letting neighboring countries acquire advanced technology or advanced aircraft. But it's definitely noteworthy that during this whole time, the Israeli government apparently knew where a lot of the major weapons facilities of the Assad regime were. They say that they've hit chemical weapons facilities. And there was 50 years of Assad rule during which, apart from the wars that they engaged in 1967 and 1973, there wasn't real fighting between these two countries. And now, within hours of the dictatorship falling, Israel has attacked the country unprovoked.
Right. Well, the thing is, it's clearly a preemptive strike. But don't they have a point? I mean, you know, groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda and so on are committed to the destruction of Israel, and the fewer weapons they have for that purpose, the better, isn't it?
Well, that's from their perspective, they can make any argument that they want, but the fact is that how people will move forward with Israel in the future is going to be determined on what their policy is. So they can't just have a policy of automatically assuming that any Muslims are automatically going to be hostile to them. And then, you know, where does it stop? If the first day of the new government, they launched the biggest assault on the country that they've ever launched, you could hardly say that the mentality of the Syrians wouldn't be that they were defending themselves if they were to engage Israel. I think it's deeply cynical. The logic of it could make sense from a certain perspective, but they're playing with fire. And I also imagine that the Israelis are probably somewhat surprised by how effective this was, and also probably somewhat frightened by the fact that of a deeply committed jihadist rebel group was able to essentially defeat a nuclear power. And right. Israel is going to have to deal with a Syrian nation that Israel currently occupies part of in the Golan, and they're going to have to deal with possibly a Syrian nation that is more pluralistic and more democratic. And having to go up against that as opposed to the corrupt, rotting dictatorship might not be as good for the for people that promote like the occupation of Gaza or the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah, but as you say, deeply committed jihadist elements in the new government. But let's move on now to the idea of asylum seeking. A number of European countries have simply suspended any asylum claims from Syria. What do you think is behind that?
Well, I think that European governments have for a long time been putting a lot of the blame for the breakdown of some social services on immigrants. There's a lot of data that shows that that's not really a very reasonable approach to it, because the fact is that a lot of European countries face the issue of having a lot of old people and not so many young people. So the biggest threat really to the European economy is the fact that there's a gigantic aging population and not enough people to take over the jobs. Immigration helps that. So I don't think that the European position is reasonable to stop these asylum claims. But their logic is that a lot of people are espousing nativist sentiments in their nations, and they want to please their voter base. So I see this as just pandering to people that are anti-immigrant. I think it's wrong because it's wonderful that the Assad regime is gone. This was probably the most brutal government on earth, and now it's gone. Wonderful, but you can't just say the day after it falls that means that Syria is now safe. These Western countries still need to be a safe haven for people that might need to flee. And for example, some of the rebel groups like the SNA are making life very dangerous for Kurdish civilians in Syria. So if a Kurdish person ends up not being able to get asylum when they come from Syria, they could be targeted by these Turkish mercenaries.
Right.
So it's not right, in my opinion.
Caught between a rock and a hard place, I suspect, these European governments. On the other hand, I suppose they are concerned about the Islamist terrorist threat as well. But thank you, Mr. Hilsman, for sharing your analysis with our audience. And have a good day, sir.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Don't go away. As always, lots more coming up. Goodbye for now.